Welcome to another unit in this course on economics. This time I want to introduce some basic terminology which is used either in books on economics and other courses in this context, or in general if you have to do something with economics. So let's start here with different terms with different time horizons. And you might know this from business administration. There usually you also differentiate this in short term, medium and long term. However, in economics, those terms are usually a bit longer. So if we talk about the short term, in economics, short term usually means around 1 year. So we do not go, in most cases, except maybe for the stock markets, in anything below the short term, especially not if you're talking about models. Medium term, that's usually the length of a business cycle, so roughly 3 to 5 years. And long term, that's in many cases the so-called infinitely long time horizon, so it's 30 to 50 years. So it's way longer than what you would consider in business administration. Well, if we talk about a time perspective, we can also talk about a regional, a geographical perspective. Here we start with the smallest unit of consideration, which is usually the municipal, the communal perspective, cities or city areas. Then we have the regional perspective. That's, a very broad definition. Region is a very, very broad definition. This could include, in some definitions, even single cities, so could be coincidental with the municipal level. Could also include whole countries, especially if the countries are relatively small, like Lithuania, Estonia, Liechtenstein, or something like this. So this is something in between here, but could include this as well as that. Could also, in very rare cases, be cross-national, so include areas from more than one country. However, if you're focusing only on countries, we have the national perspective. If you have groups of countries, we either have the supranatural or the international level. Supranatural means group of countries which, however, are relatively close to each other. So this would be like Europe or the European Union. This would be North America, something like this. The international level, that's independent of any distances, any geographical specialities. So that's the regional geographical perspective. Then we can also introduce two views or some other views on analysis. And first differentiation is between partial analyses and a total analysis. Whereas with a partial analysis, I'm focusing only on one specific aspect. Only taking a look what happens if I, for example, change this specific variable. That's also where the so-called ceteris paribus analysis comes into play. What happens if everything is kept constant except for this one specific variable? In the other perspective, we have the total analysis point of view. Here, we're taking a look what happens if everything changes. So if I said situation 1, then the situation totally changes. What will be the outcome? So here, I'm allowing all variables to fluctuate. Mathematically, with the partial analysis, you usually use first derivatives, whereas with the total analysis, we usually use the total differential. That's the main difference here. Staying with analysis, types of analysis, we can differentiate as well between static dynamic, and dynamic analysis. With a static analysis, we simply consider only one point in time. So we do not really compare anything. It's like one snapshot of a situation, describe this in detail. It's like a case study in an economic an econometric type of sense. If we want to compare two or more situations, that's mostly a static dynamic perspective, static dynamic analysis. Whereas if we're interested in the dynamics underlying developments, that's where a dynamic analysis comes into play. Then, finally, regarding the direction of analysis, we can differentiate between an ex-ante point of view and an ex-post point of view. Well, let's start with the ex-post. This basically means something has happened. You're looking back on this. So you're just analyzing what has happened and try to find out why it happened. Ex-ante is the opposite. It's looking ahead. So ex-ante includes most of the prognosis being done. That's looking ahead using models to predict what will happen, whereas ex-post is looking back what has happened. Finally, well, all analyses, as described earlier, are usually based around models. I will go back to the idea what a model is in a few slides. However, each model includes usually endogenous and exogenous variables. Exogenous variables, that's something which is given from outside the model. So in the model themselves, they act mostly like constants, like fixed parameters. Whereas endogenous variables are really variables in the model. So they are determined by solving a specific model. So they are determined via the model itself. And finally, we can differentiate between positive and normative analyses. Here the idea is with positive analysis, the focus is on simply describing what has happened, whereas with a normative analysis is trying to deduce what should have been done, what should be done. So actually giving advice, drawing conclusions on how the situation could become better, should be approached, something like this. Then, on a different point of view, we can differentiate also different types of market structures. Here we can start with a polypoly. And, well, most market structures, market types, differ in regards to how many actors on the demand and how many actors on the supply side do we have. And it usually is like one actor, few actors, very many actors. Well, with a polypoly, we have a lot of actors on the demand and a lot of actors on the supply side. Therefore, we assume usually a polypoly leading to perfect competition. Compared to this is the monopoly. With the monopoly, we only have one supplier, but a lot of demand, meaning the supplier has a lot of market power, can usually set the prices as well as the quantity he supplies. With the polypoly, you're not able to impact prices because you're just one of many. Here you're the only one, so you can actually, well, theoretically do what you want. However, if you put the prices too high, people might stop consuming in total. So this might be a problem. However, well, we go into those two types later on when we focus more on micro. Here, however, I want to introduce a few other market types. Next one would be the oligopoly. That's like something in between those two. Here we have a few suppliers, not a lot, but a few. And well, we also have the opposite thing to the monopoly, the monopson, which basically means we have only one actor on the demand side and a lot of suppliers. That could be like a big buyer and a lot of small farmers or people supplying to this one demander. Same thing goes for the oligopoly. Here we have only a few actors on the demand side, still a lot on the supply side. And finally, there's something which is not really in this type of structure, so-called monopolistic competition. Meaning we have one relatively big actor which can behave like a monopoly because he has competition, but only by very small companies and not a lot. So there is competition, but there's clearly one actor which has most of the market power. That's what's called monopolistic competition. Aside from the market types, we can also differentiate between real and nominal perspectives. Whereas here, I'm just using the simple description, don't go into detail how we can actually calculate all of this. The nominal perspective is usually in current prices. So we do not correct for price changes. So if I take wages, wages are always in the year they're reported for, in the prices of the years they're reported for. Whereas if I take a real perspective, I usually consider constant prices, so I fix the price level to a certain base year. This helps making whatever is measured in these prices comparable over time. So comparability over time, especially if we have higher inflation rates, is easier with real data than with nominal data, because nominal data is not adjusted for monetary changes, not inflation adjusted. Then, well, we have a nice differentiation, which is quite problematic in English because we would differentiate between needs and needs. But the difference lies in the fact that we can interpret needs as a necessity, something we need, and we have needs as in a requirement for a specific type of good. So for example, a need in the necessity context could be hunger, whereas the requirement perspective would be I have a requirement for food. I require food to no longer be hungry. That's the difference between needs and needs from the necessity point of view and from the requirement point of view. And well, to actually do something against needs, we have the Homo economicus always trying to act in a certain type of behavior. And that's what I want to explain here for a moment. Well, the Homo economicus, that's the ideal human, the ideal actor in economics, because he always acts rationally, always chooses the best choice. He tries to maximize his utility. This goes usually hand in hand with the rationality. Tries to get the best out of every situation. And he, for the utility maximization, he uses one of two rules. I will go to those two rules, the economic principles, in a moment. However, let's continue with the Homo economicus. He also has fixed preferences. So something like advertisements don't work on the Homo economicus because he already knows what he prefers, what are the best choices for him. He has perfect information, so he knows everything. He knows all the prices, so can actually make perfect decisions. And he reacts on restrictions. In particular, he reacts to his budget restrictions. So the Homo economicus never consumes more than he can actually afford. Well, that's the basic idea of the, let's call this, thinking paradigm of a Homo economicus in economics. This is not really a real perspective on this. If you want this a bit more practical, you should have a look on what is called behavioral economics. There, the difference is made between the Homo economicus as the ideal in economics and the so-called human, what is actually the behavior patterns of people in an economic context. But let's continue here with the before mentioned economic principle. Here we have two perspectives, the minimum and the maximum principle. The minimum principle states I have a given output and I want to achieve this output with the minimum inputs required. Whereas with the maximum principle, I have a given input and I try to achieve the maximum output possible with these inputs. If I have more than one goal, I have to go for Pareto optimality. So I always get like a border where I have the best combinations of outcomes. However, it's only Pareto optimal if I cannot achieve more in one goal without having to accept reductions, a worse off situation, in the other goal. So the first two principles work really well if I have only one goal. If I have more than one goal, I have to go with Pareto optimality, which I try to achieve. Find the best trade-off between a set of goals. Well, in this case, if I achieve or work by either the minimum or maximum principle or achieve Pareto optimality, I'm acting efficient, I'm actually economizing. Well, aside from these basic factors, I have some other terms which are not as connected as what I talked about before, but let's just go through them. I already mentioned the term of a model. Well, a model is a simplified version of the economy, or generally a simplified version, containing, however, all the important aspects or everything which is considered important in a specific context. However, a model is never perfect because it's, as I said, just a simplification of reality. Aside from a model, we can also talk about the concept of scarcity. That's the idea underlying all of economics. We need to economize, we need to act efficient because there is no good which is freely available. Supply of all goods is limited, therefore all goods are scarce, therefore all goods have a price. And that's the basic idea, that the price mirrors the scarcity of a good. And due to this fact, we need to find an optimal basket of goods to consume which will maximize our utility. And we cannot consume whatever we like because we cannot get everything, because there's not enough for everyone, because goods are scarce. Then we have the term division of labor. We won't want to go into this a little bit later on when we talk about trade as well. That it makes sense that someone specializes on what he or she can do best, because this in the end will lead to a better outcome in total. Then we have the terms marginal product or marginal productivity. In this context, I want to focus on the first part, marginal. Marginal usually means taking the first derivative. If in economics you read marginal something, usually means first derivative of whatever comes next. So if we have marginal product here, this means first derivative of the production function for a specific factor. So here I'm considering only one factor. It's like marginal product is a partial analysis, whereas marginal productivity, I'm focusing on all the different factors. That's more like a total analysis perspective. Then I have the terms allocation and distribution, whereas allocation focuses on the input perspective, which goods should be used in the production of something to optimize outcome, to minimize costs. Distribution is on what should happen with the output. So allocation focus on inputs, distribution on outputs.